The bitter, bone-chilling wind of the Blackwood territories howled through the ancient pines, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and impending winter. Inside the imposing stone-carved fortress of the Blood Moon Pack, Arthur, the undisputed Alpha King of the Northern Werewolf territories, stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his war room. He was a man built of hard angles, raw power, and a lifetime of ruthless leadership. His dark hair dusted with the light snow that had drifted through the open balcony doors. Beside him stood Garrett, his loyal beta and closest confidant, reviewing logistics maps of their expansive borderlines. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the chamber groaned open, and a young woman stepped through, escorted by 2 heavily armored pack guards. This was Clara Vance. She was slender, dressed in a woolen coat that seemed far too thin for the brutal northern climate, and her pale blue eyes looked wide, almost fragile, against the stark, dark stones of the fortress. She was a human, or so the documentation from the southern neutral territories claimed, sent to the Blackwood as part of a diplomatic tribute and administrative treaty to manage the Pack's chaotic, centuries-old archives and ledger systems. Arthur didn't even turn around fully, merely glancing at her reflection in the glass before looking back out at the frozen expanse. He let out a low, rumbling scoff that vibrated through the floorboards. "She won't last a month here," the Alpha King told his beta, his voice dripping with absolute certainty and a cold indifference that would have broken a lesser person. "Look at her, Garrett. The northern winter breaks hardened warriors. A fragile human girl from the sunny south will be begging to return home before the first true blizzard hits. Give her the dusty lower offices and let her realize her mistake on her own." Clara stood perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. If she heard the Alpha King's dismissive words, she didn't show it. She didn't flinch, nor did her posture wilt. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath, adjusting to the sudden pressure change in the room caused by Arthur's overwhelming, suffocating alpha aura. While humans usually trembled or dropped to their knees under such intense supernatural dominance, Clara merely blinked, her gaze sweeping across the war room with a quiet, analytical focus. She noticed the messy piles of ancient parchments on the side tables, the unorganized strategic maps, and the faint, distinct scent of silver-laced ink used for treaties. Garrett looked between his king and the newcomer, coughing slightly to clear the awkward tension. "Welcome to the Blackwood, Miss Vance. I am Beta Garrett, and this is Alpha King Arthur. I understand you have been sent by the arbiters of the Southern Conglomerate to oversee our transition into modern digital mapping and resource allocation. We haven't updated our records since the Great Border Shift 40 years ago." "Thank you, Beta Garrett," Clara replied. Her voice was surprisingly steady, lacking the high-pitched tremor of fear that Arthur was so accustomed to hearing from outsiders. It was melodic, but possessed a crisp, professional edge. "I am well aware of the challenges. The Southern Archives spoke at length about the complexity of the Blackwood ledger systems. Or rather, the lack thereof. I assure you, I am not easily deterred by a little cold weather." Arthur finally turned around completely, crossing his massive arms over his chest. His amber eyes, a testament to his wolf's dominant nature, locked onto hers. He moved with a predatory grace that usually made people back away, but Clara held her ground, meeting his gaze with a serene, unreadable expression. "It's not just the cold human," Arthur murmured, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the subtle, hypnotic undertone of an alpha command meant to instill obedience. "This pack runs on strength, hierarchy, and survival. We do not have time to babysit an archivist who breaks a bone every time she slips on the courtyard ice. My warriors are loud, our customs are harsh, and the darkness of the north lasts for 18 hours a day during the peak of winter. If you fail to keep up, or if your presence compromises our administrative efficiency during the hunting season, you will be sent packing on the next supply wagon south." "Understood, Alpha King," Clara said, dipping her head in a polite, albeit minimal, nod of respect. "But if I may say so, Efficiency is exactly what I bring. From what I have observed just walking through your main gates, your supply lines are bottlenecked. Your guards are burning twice as much firewood as necessary due to poorly insulated barracks, and your tribute ledgers are running on an outdated decimal system that likely costs you thousands of gold credits in lost trade revenue every quarter. I do not require babysitting. I require access to your records. Garrett raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine amusement and surprise crossing his features. Arthur's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. It had been an incredibly long time since anyone, let alone a human woman who barely reached his shoulder, had dared to criticize the operational structure of the Blood Moon Pack within 5 minutes of meeting him. The tension in the room grew thick enough to slice with a dagger, the air crackling with Arthur's unspoken irritation. The lower archives are through the eastern spiral staircase, Arthur said coldly, turning his back to her once more, effectively ending the conversation. Garrett will show you the way. Do not get underfoot, and do not expect special treatment at the dining hall. You eat what the pack eats, and you work the hours the pack works. That will be more than sufficient, Clara stated smoothly. As Garrett led Clara out of the war room and down the winding, torchlit corridors of the ancient stone fortress, the temperature began to drop significantly. The lower archives were located deep within the subterranean levels of the castle, carved directly into the bedrock of the mountain. When Garrett pushed open the heavy iron-reinforced doors, a cloud of dust and the musty smell of centuries-old paper billowed out. The room was massive, filled to the ceiling with towering wooden shelves that groaned under the weight of disorganized scrolls, leather-bound books, and loose sheets of parchment. A solitary, cracked stone hearth sat cold in the corner, and the only light came from narrow slits high up on the wall, near the ground level of the outer courtyard. It's a bit of a disaster area, I admit, Garrett said apologetically, rubbing the back of his neck. The last pack historian passed away a decade ago, and since then, we've just been throwing every tax document, border treaty, and birth record in here. Arthur doesn't value paperwork much. He believes a pack is run through strength of arms and absolute loyalty. Strength without structure is just chaos waiting for a catalyst, Clara murmured, stepping into the room. She reached out, her slender fingers brushing against a dusty ledger. She pulled it open, her eyes scanning the complex, archaic script used by the old northern packs. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. This will do perfectly. Garrett watched her for a moment, wondering if she was putting on a brave face. If you need anything, Clara, blankets, more candles, or if the cold becomes too much, you can ask me. Arthur is a fair ruler, but he has no patience for vulnerability. He has faced assassination attempts, rogue uprisings, and bitter border wars since he took the throne at 19. He views softness as a disease. Softness and resilience are often confused by those who only know how to fight, Beta Garrett. Clara replied softly, looking up at him. Thank you for the guidance. I will begin immediately. Left alone in the freezing gloom of the archives, Clara didn't waste a single moment. She pulled off her thin coat, revealing a practical dark woolen dress underneath, and began rolling up her sleeves. She didn't light the fireplace right away. Instead, she walked around the perimeter of the room, tapping the stone walls, inspecting the structural integrity of the shelves, and organizing the space in her mind. Her movements were methodical, precise, and entirely devoid of the panic one might expect from someone exiled to the bowels of a terrifying werewolf fortress. By the time night fell, the temperature in the archives had plummeted below freezing. Up in the grand dining hall, the Blood Moon Pack was roaring with life. Huge roasts of meat were being consumed, ale was flowing, and the heat from the massive central hearth kept the warriors warm and boisterous. Arthur sat at the head of the high table, tearing into a piece of venison, his sharp eyes scanning his pack. He noticed Garrett entering and filling a plate with standard rations: stew, thick bread, and a flagon of water. "Are you delivering rations to our temporary guest?" Arthur asked, his voice cutting through the noise of the table. "Yes, Alpha," Garrett replied. "She's been down there for hours. I figured she could use a warm meal." Arthur snorted, leaning back in his chair. "Save your pity, Garrett. She'll probably be crying by tomorrow morning, complaining that the ink is freezing in her well. Let her feel the true weight of the Blackwood. If she wants to play at being an administrator for the most powerful pack in the North, she needs to realize that words on paper mean nothing if you don't have the stomach to survive the winter." Several nearby high-ranking warriors laughed in agreement, mocking the fragile human who thought she could bring Southern order to their wild, feral home. They swapped stories of previous human diplomats who had fled within days, unable to handle the terrifying presence of shifted wolves or the relentless, brutal pranks of the pack youth. Garrett didn't join in the laughter. He simply nodded and made his way down to the archives. But when he pushed the heavy door open, the scene that greeted him was completely unexpected. The cold hearth was now roaring with a controlled, perfectly built fire that cast a warm, dancing glow across the room. The thick layers of dust that had covered the floor were gone, swept into a neat pile near the door. But it was the shelves that caught his breath. In just a matter of hours, Clara had completely cleared 3 massive sections. Hundreds of books and scrolls were now arranged in flawless alphabetical order, with small color-coded wax tabs sticking out of them. Clara herself was sitting at a heavy wooden desk she had dragged closer to the fire. She was writing furiously in a brand-new ledger, her pen strokes fluid and rapid. She didn't look like a freezing, broken human. She looked like a general commanding an army of information. "I brought you some dinner," Garrett said, his voice unusually quiet as he approached the desk. Clara looked up, her pale eyes reflecting the firelight. "Thank you, Garrett. Put it right there, please." She pointed to a cleared corner of the desk. "I've already cataloged your agricultural outputs for the last 7 years. Your records are riddled with mathematical discrepancies, by the way. Your southern border farms have been underreporting their barley yields by nearly 15%. They're skimming off the top, likely selling it to independent rogue merchants along the neutral zone." Garrett froze, his eyes widening. "What? That's impossible. The southern border is managed by Gamma Thomas. He's a fiercely loyal warrior. He may be loyal in battle, but he's terrible at math. Or he's actively lying to you," Clara said calmly, dipping her pen into the ink. "The seed allocation numbers don't match the final harvest weights, even taking into account the early frost of 3 years ago. I'll have the full report ready for the Alpha King by tomorrow morning." Garrett stared at her, a sinking feeling in his stomach. If Clara was right, a human woman had just uncovered a massive breach of pack law and potential treason within her first 6 hours on the job. Meanwhile, high above them in the shadows of the fortress's outer parapets, a pair of glowing red eyes watched the courtyard. A figure cloaked in heavy fur whispered into the freezing wind, sending a message through a small, trained shadow raven. The message was simple. "The Southern Archivist has arrived. She is already digging into the old ledgers. Proceed with the secondary plan before she uncovers the true anomalies." Back in the archives, Clara suddenly stopped writing. She tilted her head, her ears straining. To a normal human, the fortress was completely silent save for the crackle of the fire. But Clara's eyes narrowed as she looked toward the narrow air vent high up on the stone wall. She felt a strange, subtle vibration in the stone beneath her feet. A rhythmic, repeating pattern that didn't match the random shifting of the mountain or the heavy footsteps of the werewolf guards upstairs. It was a code. A rhythmic sequence used only by a specific, highly secretive faction of underground operatives she had encountered once before in her past. Clara slowly closed her ledger, her face devoid of fear, replaced instead by a cold, calculative intensity that no one in the Blood Moon Pack had ever seen. She looked at the crackling fire, then down at her hands, which were perfectly steady despite the freezing draft. Who was she really? And why did a simple Southern archivist know the secret military codes of the continent's most dangerous rogue network? The Shadow Raven took flight from the parapet, disappearing into the dark, snowy night, leaving the fortress wrapped in a deceptive silence. What deep-seated secrets were buried within the ancient pages of the Blackwood archives? And what would happen when the Alpha King realized that the fragile human he had dismissed so easily was holding the threads of his entire kingdom's survival? By the third week of the biting northern winter, the atmosphere inside the Blood Moon Fortress had subtly shifted. The relentless blizzards had arrived, burying the outer courtyards under 4 feet of dense snow and trapping the pack within the thick stone walls. Yet, down in the subterranean archives, the cold had been entirely conquered. Clara Vance had transformed the damp, forgotten vault into an administrative nerve center. Rows of chaotic scrolls were now pristine, color-coded archives, and a massive chalkboard she had commissioned from the pack blacksmiths hung on the wall, covered in complex intersecting supply chains and resource flowcharts. Arthur sat in his high-backed leather chair in the war room, staring down at a bound leather dossier that Garrett had dropped onto his desk. The Alpha King's face was unreadable, but the slight flare of his nostrils betrayed his inner turbulence. "She found it in the tithe registers from the western logging villages," Garrett explained, leaning against the heavy oak table. "Gamma Thomas wasn't just skimming barley, Arthur. He's been masking a massive discrepancy in our silver oak timber yields for the past 3 years." Clara cross-referenced the transport logs with the blacksmith's manufacturing receipts. The numbers don't lie. Someone is stockpiling timber capable of resisting supernatural fire, and they're doing it under our noses. Arthur opened the dossier. The handwriting was impeccable, sharp, elegant, and perfectly organized. Every claim was backed by a precise page reference to an archaic ledger. "And you're certain a human compiled this? Without a single mistake?" "She didn't just compile it, Arthur. She explained the entire economic motive to me like I was a pup learning to hunt," Garrett said with a wry smile. "She pointed out that the missing timber matches the exact structural requirements for building fortified underground bunkers. She's smart, dangerously smart." Arthur stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the room. "Intelligence in a human is a fragile shield, Garrett. It doesn't stop a wolf's jaws. I want to know who she really is. No simple Southern clerk possesses the structural knowledge of Northern Pack logistics. Have our contacts in the Southern conglomerate verified her background? They say she's exactly who she claims to be. An orphan raised by the Scholastic Guild of the Neutral Zone, specializing in historical preservation," Garrett replied, his tone growing serious. "But I watched her yesterday when one of the younger enforcers dropped a heavy iron crate near her desk to startle her. She didn't even blink. Her heart rate didn't even spike. I caught her scent, Arthur. It's entirely human. No magic, no wolf. But there's an undercurrent of something. Frozen. Like she's completely detached from fear." Arthur's amber eyes flashed with a dangerous curiosity. "Let us see how detached she is when the cold truly bites." An hour later, the heavy iron doors of the archives swung open with a resounding echo. Clara did not look up from her desk, her fountain pen continuing its rhythmic scratching against the parchment. "If you are here to deliver the quarterly metalwork inventory, Beta Garrett, you can leave it on the lower shelf by the hearth." "It isn't Garrett." A deep, rumbling voice vibrated through the room. Clara paused, her pen hovering a millimeter above the paper. She slowly raised her head to find Alpha King Arthur standing at the edge of her workspace. He had discarded his heavy formal cloaks, wearing only a dark, fitted leather tunic that emphasized his intimidating muscular build. His aura was unbridled, a thick, suffocating wave of dominant alpha pressure that usually forced subordinates to drop to their knees out of sheer instinct. The air in the room grew heavy, the fire in the hearth flickering as if intimidated by his presence. Clara calmly placed her pen in its brass holder, closed her inkwell, and stood up. She offered a precise, respectful bow from the waist. "Alpha King, to what do I owe the honor of a visit to the lower depths?" Arthur walked forward, his footsteps silent despite his size. He circled her desk, his sharp gaze taking in the immaculate organization, the chalkboards, and the sheer volume of work she had completed. "You've been busy, Miss Vance." My beta tells me you've uncovered a thread of treason that my own internal shadow guards missed for 3 years. Your shadow guards are trained to look for physical anomalies, sense of betrayal, secret meetings in the woods, broken oaths. Clara replied smoothly, her pale blue eyes meeting his without a hint of tremor. They do not look at the numbers. A wolf can lie with his scent if he is disciplined enough, Alpha King. But a ledger never learns how to lie. The math is always honest. Arthur stopped directly in front of her, leaning down slightly so his face was mere inches from hers. The heat radiating from his supernatural body was intense, contrasting sharply with the cool air of the room. You speak with a lot of authority for someone whose neck I could snap with 2 fingers. Tell me, Clara, why does a southern human care if my gamma is stealing timber? Why not let us rot from the inside out? It would make the South safer. Because a disorganized North is a volatile North, Clara said, her voice dropping into a calm, pragmatic cadence. If the Blood Moon Pack falls into civil war or economic ruin, the rogue factions in the neutral zones will spill over the borders. The southern territories rely on your stability to keep the true monsters at bay. My mandate is efficiency and preservation. I am simply doing my job. Arthur's eyes narrowed. He reached out, his large, calloused hand moving with blinding speed toward her throat. A normal human would have screamed, ducked, or frozen in terror. Clara did neither. She merely tilted her head back slightly, allowing his hand to stop a mere fraction of an inch from her skin. His thumb brushed against her pulse point. His wolf rumbled inside his chest, confused and intrigued. Her heart rate was perfectly steady, 60 beats per minute. Calm, rhythmic, unbothered. You're an anomaly, Arthur murmured, his voice a low growl as he slowly lowered his hand. No human faces an Alpha King in his own stronghold without showing a flicker of survival instinct. Who trained you to suppress your scent and your fear so perfectly? Survival in the South requires a different kind of armor, Your Grace, Clara replied, her expression a mask of professional politeness. While your people fight with claws, mine fight with information. I suggest we focus on the threat at hand. Gamma Thomas isn't just stockpiling timber. He is preparing for a siege. Arthur's demeanor instantly hardened, the predatory curiosity replaced by the cold calculation of a warlord. A siege? Against whom? No pack in the Northern Alliance has the strength to challenge the Blood Moon. Clara walked over to her massive chalkboard, picking up a piece of white chalk. With quick practice strokes, she drew a map of the Blackwood territories, highlighting the hidden mountain passes. According to the historical migration records of the indigenous fauna from 80 years ago, a fact that is highly relevant to your hunting territories, the dire wolf populations only migrate south when a massive predator or an unnatural environmental shift occurs in the deep frost wastes. This year, the migration started 2 months early. Thomas isn't planning to fight you, Arthur. He is building bunkers because he knows something is coming out of the northern wastes. Something that will bypass your outer border guards entirely. Arthur stared at the board, his strategic mind instantly grasping the gravity of her analysis. The early migration of the dire wolves had been dismissed by his scouts as a fluke of the harsh winter. But looking at Clara's data, the pattern was undeniable. Why would Thomas keep this a secret from his king? Arthur mused aloud, his jaw clenching. Perhaps because he doesn't believe you can win, Clara said softly. Or perhaps because he has already made a deal with whatever is coming. Before Arthur could respond, the heavy stone walls of the fortress vibrated. A low, echoing horn sounded from the surface, 3 sharp, urgent blasts, the alarm for an internal breach. Arthur's radio piece crackled to life, Garrett's frantic voice breaking through the static. Alpha, we have a situation in the lower western cells, Gamma Thomas. He didn't wait for us to confront him. He just triggered a structural collapse in the supply tunnels. The lower barracks are flooding with freezing groundwater, and the eastern armory is completely cut off. Arthur cursed under his breath, his eyes snapping to Clara. "Stay here. Do not leave this room." "The eastern armory contains your primary supply of silver-tipped weaponry, correct?" Clara asked, her voice cracking like a whip, entirely devoid of her previous deference. "Yes," Arthur barked, already moving toward the door. "The structural maps from 1842 show a secondary ventilation shaft that bypasses the flooded tunnels," Clara said, her fingers flying through a drawer and pulling out a faded blue parchment blueprint. She held it out to him. "If you send a squad through the old cellars beneath the kitchen, they can reach the armory before the water levels rise too high. Do not use the main corridor. It will collapse under the weight of shifted wolves." Arthur snatched the blueprint from her hand, staring at her with a mixture of shock and newfound respect. "How did you find this?" "I read," Clara said simply, already pulling her boots on and grabbing a heavy leather ledger. "Now go. Your pack needs its king." As Arthur sprinted out of the room, his mind raced. The fragile human he had dismissed as a liability had just saved his armory, diagnosed a geopolitical crisis, and shown more tactical composure than half his war council. Down in the shadows of the secondary ventilation shaft, far from where Arthur was leading his men, a figure shifted in the darkness. The cloaked operative who had sent the Shadow Raven weeks prior adjusted a heavy iron valve, directing the icy groundwater toward the lower storage units. But as the figure turned to escape, a soft, deliberate footstep echoed in the damp tunnel. The operative spun around, bearing elongated fangs, expecting a heavy wolf guard. Instead, standing in the dim light of a single crystal lantern, was Clara Vance. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She was holding a small silver pocket watch, watching the gears turn with a look of profound boredom. "You're late, Thomas," Clara said, her voice echoing coldly in the wet stone tunnel. The cloaked figure pulled back his hood, revealing the scarred, rugged face of Gamma Thomas. He sneered, his wolf eyes glowing red in the dark. "The human clerk. You ruined everything with your damn ledgers. But it doesn't matter now. The Frostborn are already at the gates, and Arthur will drown in his own fortress. Move aside, girl, or I'll tear your throat out." Clara didn't move. She slowly closed the pocket watch with a crisp click. "I told your employers in the Southern conglomerate that you were too sloppy to handle a logistics operation of this scale. You left a trail of numbers a child could follow. And now you forced me to accelerate my timeline." Thomas froze, his wolf instinct suddenly screaming at him to back away. The scent around Clara hadn't changed, but the sheer, crushing weight of her presence suddenly felt heavier, colder, and far more terrifying than the Alpha King's raw power. It was the aura of someone who didn't just command strength, but commanded the very environment around them. What are you?" Thomas stammered, stepping back. Clara smiled, a beautiful, terrifying expression that didn't reach her pale blue eyes. "I am the new administrator of the Blackwood, Thomas, and your contract has just been liquidated." Before the rogue Gamma could even lung, the shadows around the tunnel seemed to stretch, a sudden, localized drop in pressure making his ears pop. A muffled choke escaped his throat as he stumbled backward into the darkness of the collapsing shaft. A split second later, a massive tremor shook the tunnel, completely sealing the passage with a roar of falling stone. Clara stood perfectly still as the dust cleared, her dress untainted, her expression serene. She adjusted her collar, picked up her leather ledger, and turned back toward the archives, leaving no trace of her presence behind. Upstairs, Arthur would find the armory saved, the flood contained, and Gamma Thomas missing, presumably crushed by his own sabotage. He would think he was fighting a war against an external enemy, entirely unaware that the most dangerous player on the board was currently walking back to her desk, ready to rewrite the history of the North. By the time the midwinter solstice arrived, the physical transformation of the Blood Moon Pack's operations was total. What Arthur had assumed would be a month of tearful complaints from a fragile outsider had instead become a masterclass in systemic restructuring. Clara Vance no longer worked out of the freezing lower depths. By silent, unspoken consensus of the High Council, her headquarters had been moved to the sunlit tower adjacent to the war room. The pack warriors, initially prone to mocking the southern human, now watched her pass through the stone courtyards with a quiet, almost superstitious reverence. It wasn't just that she had saved the armory during Gamma Thomas's treachery, or that she had accurately predicted the early dire wolf migration. It was her uncanny efficiency. Under her calculated directives, the fortress's firewood consumption dropped by 40% through simple thermal zoning. The rationing system she introduced eliminated food waste entirely, and for the first time in 3 decades, the Blood Moon border guards were receiving their silver-tipped arrows and winter provisions a week ahead of schedule. Arthur stood at the high balcony of his war room, watching Clara down in the courtyard. She was dressed in a dark, tailored velvet coat lined with thick, northern wolf fur, a gift from Beta Garrett that she had accepted with nothing more than a professional nod. She was inspecting a shipment of iron ore, speaking to a massive, scarred sub-alpha blacksmith who was nodding submissively to her words, taking notes on a small slate board. "She's running the entire logistics network, Arthur," Garrett said, stepping up beside the king, his voice filled with genuine awe. "The elders are calling her the Winter Ledger. The young pups think she's some kind of administrative witch. Even the border patrols won't change their rotation schedules unless Clara signs off on the supply allocations first." Arthur's hand gripped the stone railing, his knuckles turning white. His wolf was restless, a low, constant vibration inside his chest. For months, he had tried to find the crack in her armor. He had subjected her to terrifying war councils, forced her to witness the brutal, bloody disciplinary rituals of the pack, and intentionally unleashed his rawest, most suffocating alpha aura in her presence. Every single time, she had remained entirely unmoved, treating his displays of supernatural dominance like minor weather inconveniences. "She is a human, Garrett," Arthur growled, though his voice lacked its original conviction. "A human cannot hold the reins of a werewolf pack. The hierarchy is built on blood and strength. By summer, when the war councils begin for the southern trade routes, the alphas of the allied packs will not take orders from a woman who cannot even shift." "They aren't taking orders from her yet," Garrett pointed out gently. "But they are eating the food she secured, using the weapons she budgeted, and sleeping in the insulated barracks she designed. In the North, Arthur, survival is the truest form of strength. And right now, Clara Vance is the reason we are surviving this winter." Before Arthur could reply, the heavy doors of the war room burst open. A scout from the northernmost perimeter stumbled into the room, covered in a thick layer of frost, his breath coming in ragged, panicky gasps. He dropped to one knee, his chest heaving. "Alpha King!" the scout cried out, his eyes wide with terror. "The northern wall. It has been breached, not by rogues. The Frostborn have crossed the frozen expanse. They bypassed the physical watchtowers entirely. They're moving through the shadow veins of the mountain." Arthur's posture instantly changed, his predatory instincts taking over. "How many?" "Hundreds, Your Grace. They are led by Gamma Thomas," the scout stammered, coughing up a fleck of frozen blood. "He didn't die in the tunnel collapse. He's changed. His eyes are entirely white, and his skin is like blue ice. He brought the ancient Wendigo kin with him. They're targeting the central keep." "Assemble the vanguard," Arthur roared, his voice booming through the fortress, triggering the immediate howling response of hundreds of shifted wolves across the territory. "Garrett, seal the lower levels. Get the non-combatants to the deep bunkers Clara fortified." "Already on it," a calm, melodic voice interrupted from the doorway. Clara stepped into the room, holding a massive, leather-bound tactical ledger. She didn't look panicked. Her face was as cold and sharp as a diamond. Beta Garrett, do not use the lower bunkers. The Wendigo kin travel through groundwater and subterranean frost lines. If you lock the pack in the deep cellars, you are putting them in a slaughterhouse. Arthur stepped toward her, his amber eyes blazing with a mix of fury and urgency. This is a military crisis, Clara. You know nothing of supernatural warfare. The bunkers are reinforced with 3 feet of solid granite. Granite cracks when subjected to flash freezing, Alpha King, Clara said, her voice dropping into a commanding, authoritative tone that completely cut through his anger. She slammed the ledger open onto the war table, pointing directly to a complex geological map of the fortress mountain. The Frostborn use localized cryogenic magic. Look at the tectonic faults I cataloged last month. If they strike the base of the western mountain, the entire subterranean structure collapses. You must move the non-combatants to the upper Grand Hall. It is insulated with silver oak timber, the very timber Gamma Thomas was stockpiling. Arthur froze, the puzzle pieces suddenly clicking together in his mind with terrifying clarity. Thomas hadn't been building a bunker to hide from a threat. He had been hoarding the only material in the entire territory that was entirely immune to the Frostborn's freezing magic, ensuring that his own faction would survive while the rest of the Blood Moon Pack was frozen alive inside their stone fortress. "You knew," Arthur whispered, staring at Clara with a sudden, profound realization. "You didn't just find the missing timber. You knew exactly what it was for." "I am an archivist, Arthur. I look at history to predict the future," Clara said smoothly. "Now, order your vanguard to hold the narrow bridge at the eastern gorge. The Frostborn are heavy. Their ice armor will cause the suspension ropes to snap if they attempt to cross in formation. Use fire-tipped ballistae to break their cohesion." Arthur looked at her for a single, long second. The fragile human he had dismissed as a temporary nuisance was now dictating the tactical defensive strategy of the most powerful pack in the north. And the most terrifying part was that her strategy was flawless. "Do exactly as she says," Arthur commanded Garrett, who nodded and sprinted out of the room to rally the pack warriors. Turning to Clara, Arthur drew his massive, silver-etched broadsword. "And what will you do, Miss Vance?" "I will remain here, managing the resource flow and monitoring the structural integrity of the keep," Clara replied, picking up her fountain pen. "Try not to get blood on my maps, Your Grace. It makes the ink run." Arthur let out a harsh, wild laugh, a sound of pure, adrenaline-fueled admiration, before shifting halfway into his massive, midnight black wolf form and leaping over the balcony railing down into the snow-covered chaos of the courtyard below. The battle raged for hours. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple as the supernatural blizzard unleashed by the Frostborn clashed with the raw, fiery fury of the Blood Moon Pack. From her high tower window, Clara watched the conflict unfold like a massive, bloody game of chess. Every time a line wavered, she dispatched a runner with precise instructions. Send 3 more barrels of oil to the western wall, shift the archers to the southern parapets. Redirect the wounded to the secondary medical ward. She was the brain of the beast, coordinating hundreds of moving parts with mathematical precision. But down at the eastern gorge, the narrative took a devastating turn. Gamma Thomas, his body mutated into a towering monstrosity of ice and corrupted fur, shattered the fire ballistae with a single wave of his frost-shattered hand. He bypassed Arthur's vanguard entirely through a massive, hidden cavern system that had been omitted from all modern maps. Arthur, fighting like a demon in the center of the gorge, realized too late that he had been baited. The main force of the Frostborn wasn't attacking the walls. They were already inside the fortress, having breached the upper Grand Hall from the ancient air shafts. A chilling howl echoed from the heart of the castle. Arthur's heart dropped. The non-combatants. His pack. He scrambled back toward the keep, his massive paws tearing through the bloody snow, but he knew he was too far away. The internal defenses were broken. The Blood Moon Pack was about to be annihilated from within. Inside the upper Grand Hall, the heavy oak doors splintered into 1,000 icy shards. Gamma Thomas stepped through the frost, his white eyes locking onto the trembling children and elders huddled near the silver oak hearth. Behind him stood a dozen towering Wendigo kin, their jaws dripping with frozen saliva. "Arthur's kingdom ends tonight," Thomas rumbled, his voice like grinding glaciers. "The North belongs to the frost." "I highly doubt that." A calm, terrifyingly familiar voice echoed from the shadowed balcony above the hall. Thomas looked up, a cruel sneer twisting his frozen face. "The human clerk, do you have a ledger to throw at me, girl? You are nothing but a fragile piece of meat." Clara Vance walked slowly down the stone staircase. She had discarded her velvet coat, wearing only a simple dark dress. But as she descended, the temperature in the room didn't drop further. It stabilized. The raging, magical blizzard outside suddenly seemed to lose its power, the howling wind dying down to a dead silence. And then, the true plot twist of the Blackwood Territories revealed itself. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't call for guards. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath, and as she did, a terrifying, suffocating wave of power erupted from her slender frame. It wasn't an alpha wolf's aura. It wasn't human magic. It was something far older, far more primordial. The crushing, absolute dominance of an ancient true-blood vampire, a descendant of the forgotten eternal sovereigns of the Deep South. Her pale blue eyes bled into a deep, luminescent crimson. Two sharp, pristine fangs elongated past her lower lip. The scent that Garrett had previously described as frozen wasn't the absence of fear. It was the scent of an apex predator that had been dead to the world for 3 centuries, masking her true nature behind a perfectly maintained glamour. "You think you brought the cold to the North, Thomas?" Clara whispered, her voice multiplying into a chorus of terrifying, echoing echoes that made the Wendigo kin instantly drop to their knees in instinctual terror. "I am the daughter of the first winter. I ruled the dark before your ancestors learned how to walk on 4 legs. Thomas stumbled back, his icy composure shattering into absolute panic. And True Blood, in the North, the Southern conglomerate. They sent an archivist. They sent their sovereign to reclaim a lost territory," Clara said, stepping onto the main floor. The stone beneath her black slippers cracked, a dark, velvet-like frost spreading outward, completely neutralizing Thomas's blue ice. "You messed with my numbers, Thomas. And as I told you before, I do not tolerate inefficiency." With a movement so fast it defied the laws of physics, Clara vanished from the stairs and reappeared directly in front of the giant, mutated Gamma. Before he could even raise his arms, her slender hand plunged straight into his chest, bypassing his frozen armor like it was warm butter. Her fingers wrapped around his icy, black heart. "Let us see how honest your math is now," she whispered into his ear. With a brutal, effortless twist, she ripped the frozen heart from his chest. Gamma Thomas shattered into a million pieces of ordinary, non-magical ice, dissolving into a harmless puddle on the stone floor. The remaining Wendigo kin let out a collective, terrified shriek, turned on their heels, and fled back into the dark shafts, completely broken by the sheer, ungodly display of dominant power. Clara stood in the center of the hall, holding the melting ice heart. She let it drop to the floor, her crimson eyes slowly fading back into a calm, pale blue. Her fangs retracted, her aura vanishing back into the deep, unreadable silence of a simple human clerk. She turned to the stunned, silent crowd of werewolf elders and children, who were staring at her with a mixture of absolute terror and profound salvation. She pulled a clean silk handkerchief from her pocket, wiped her bloody fingers with meticulous care, and looked up at the shattered doorway, where Arthur, the Alpha King, had just arrived, covered in battle wounds and completely frozen in shock. Clara offered a small, flawless professional bow. "The internal breach has been neutralized, Alpha King. I have already calculated the repair costs for the Grand Hall doors. It will come out of Gamma Thomas's seized assets." The silence that blanketed the upper Grand Hall was heavier than any snowstorm the Blackwood Territories had ever seen. Arthur stood frozen in the shattered doorway, his massive wolf chest heaving, his claws still dripping with the dark blood of the Frostborn he had slain on his frantic sprint back to the castle. He looked from the glittering puddle of ice that used to be Gamma Thomas, to his trembling pack members, and finally to Clara Vance. She stood there, perfectly composed, casually tucking her blood-stained silk handkerchief into her pocket. The terrifying, crimson-eyed apex predator that had just effortlessly brought down a mutated werewolf monstrosity was gone, replaced once again by the elegant, serene Southern archivist. Yet the air around her still hummed with a residual, suffocating power that made Arthur's wolf lower its head in a gesture he had never shown to another living soul. Submission. "You're a true blood." Arthur finally spoke, his voice a low, raspy gravel that vibrated through the silent room. He didn't advance. For the first time in his life, the Alpha King was treading with absolute caution. The Southern conglomerate didn't send an administrator to balance our books. They sent an immortal executioner. "They sent a ruler, Arthur," Clara corrected him softly, her pale blue eyes meeting his amber ones with total equality. "The Southern conglomerate is merely the modern public face of my family's ancient estate. For 300 years, the South has watched the northern werewolf packs tear each other apart over border lines, bleeding your resources and threatening the stability of the entire continent. We didn't want to conquer you with armies. That is a loud, messy, and highly inefficient way to govern." She walked past him, her dark velvet coat sweeping across the stone floor, completely unbothered by the perimeter of elite wolf guards, who instinctively parted for her like the Red Sea. "So, I decided to manage you myself, to see if the wild alphas of the North could be integrated into a civilized global trade network, or if you were truly the primitive beasts the Southern Councils claimed you to be." Arthur turned slowly, watching her walk out into the corridor toward the war room. "And what is your verdict, Sovereign Clara?" Clara paused at the threshold, glancing back over her shoulder with a faint, enigmatic smile. "You possess an admirable capacity for survival, Alpha King. But survival is merely the baseline. Let us see how you handle prosperity." As the weeks bled into months, the bitter northern winter finally began to lose its grip on the Blackwood territories. The thundering blizzards gave way to the soft, rhythmic patter of early spring rain, melting the thick sheets of ice from the fortress parapets and revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. But the melting ice brought a completely new reality to the Blood Moon Pack. The revelation of Clara's true identity had initially sparked a tense, silent standoff among the High Council. Several of the older traditionalist alphas demanded her immediate execution, arguing that a vampire operating in the heart of werewolf territory was a declaration of war. But Arthur silenced them with a single, deafening growl that shattered the wine glasses on the council table. He reminded them that without her tactical genius, their armory would be gone. Without her logistics, they would have starved. And without her ancient power, their children would have been frozen corpses in the Grand Hall. More importantly, Clara had become entirely indispensable. By the time the first wild green shoots of spring sprouted along the southern border, Clara had completely formalized the northern trade agreements. She didn't use fangs or coercion. She used the flawless, unarguable logic of her ledgers. She negotiated a massive timber and iron export treaty with the Southern conglomerate that quadrupled the Blood Moon Pack's wealth in a single financial quarter. The independent rogue factions along the neutral zone, terrified of the whispers surrounding the Winter Ledger, abandoned their smuggling operations and voluntarily petitioned to join the Blood Moon Trade Protectorate. One warm evening in late May, as the twilight sky turned a brilliant shade of amber and violet, Arthur walked out onto the grand balcony of the war room. The fortress was unrecognizable from the chaotic, gloomy stronghold Clara had arrived at months ago. The courtyards were cleanly paved, illuminated by automated oil lamps designed by the Southern guilds she had brought in. Down below, shifted wolves and human merchants from the south were laughing together, trading goods in a bustling, prosperous night market. Clara was standing by the stone railing, watching the sunset. She was dressed in a sleek, modern dark suit that blended southern elegance with northern utility. Her pale skin caught the warm glow of the dying sun, making her look radiant, almost human. "The council finalized the new border expansion budgets today," Arthur said, stepping up beside her. He didn't wear his heavy warrior armor anymore. He wore a tailored leather jacket, his posture relaxed, but still carrying the immense dignity of a king. Garrett said the Southern delegates signed off on the grain subsidies without a single objection. They didn't even try to negotiate the tariff rates. "Of course they didn't," Clara said, not taking her eyes off the horizon. "They know I wrote the tariff laws. They wouldn't dare insult my math." Arthur let out a low, soft chuckle, a sound of profound contentment. He looked down at the bustling market, then at the woman beside him. "When you first arrived, in the middle of that terrible freeze, I told Garrett that you wouldn't last a month here. I thought you were a fragile little bird that the North would break." "I remember," Clara murmured, a touch of dry wit in her tone. "You told me that words on paper meant nothing if you didn't have the stomach to survive the winter." "I was a fool," Arthur admitted openly, his amber eyes softening as he looked at her. "You didn't just survive our winter, Clara. You tamed it. You took a wild, fractured kingdom that was rotting from the inside out and turned it into the most sophisticated superpower on this continent. By winter, you were our strategist. By spring, you were our savior. And now, as summer arrives..." He paused, gesturing down toward the roaring cheers of the pack warriors raised in her honor in the courtyard below. "It is clear to everyone that you run this entire pack." Clara finally turned her head, her pale blue eyes locking onto his. For a brief second, a flicker of that ancient crimson true-blood flame danced in the depths of her pupils. Not out of malice, but out of absolute, undisputed authority. "A pack is a complex equation, Arthur," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her 300 years of wisdom. "Strength is a variable, loyalty is a constant, but efficiency is the master key. I didn't take your kingdom by force, Alpha King. I simply made myself the only logical choice for its future." Arthur smiled, raising his glass of dark northern mead toward her in a silent toast of total respect and shared rule. "To the Winter Ledger, may your numbers always balance." Clara clicked her crystal glass against his, the sound ringing out clearly over the music and laughter of the thriving fortress below. "They always do, Arthur. They always do." As the last rays of the summer sun dipped below the rugged, pine-covered mountains of the Blackwood, the territory was no longer a place of isolated terror and frozen survival. It was a beacon of a new era, an empire built on the perfect, lethal harmony of a werewolf's strength and an immortal queen's calculation. The fragile human girl who wasn't supposed to last a month had rewritten the laws of the wild, leaving the world to wonder, when the true darkness of the next winter comes, who will really be leading the hunt? Did you see this twist regarding Clara's true identity coming? Let us know in the comments what you thought of Alpha King Arthur's fate, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.